Marchal was already reading from the article when Brigitte Bardot reached across the table and took it from his hands. The cameras didn't cut. For a moment, no one at the table moved. Minutes earlier, the article had already been in his hands when the broadcast cameras went live. He held it open at table height with both hands on the pages, his fingers spread across the lower margins to keep the paper flat, his eyes moving across the lines with the unhurried attention of a man who had read the same passage many times and was now simply locating his starting point. Brigitte Bardot sat 3 seats to his left at the same panel table, with no document in front of her, no notes, no program, no pen, nothing on the table surface that belonged to her or gave her equal footing in the exchange that had already begun before the moderator opened his mouth. The round table was live on ORTF, Studio 4, Maison de la Radio. The broadcast light above the primary camera lens was already red when the floor director stepped back from the set. The studio audience of roughly 60 sat in tiered rows behind the cameras, programs in their laps, the low hum of a crowd settling into attention already fading as the set lights came to full brightness. 3 other panelists occupied the seats between Bardot and Marchal, a cultural journalist, a novelist, and a radio producer, each of them with printed materials, stacked pages, or open notebooks on the table in front of them. The moderator had opened the segment by naming each panelist in sequence, left to right along the table, his voice moving through the introductions at a practiced pace. When he reached Bardot, he paused 1 full beat longer than he had paused for any of the others before continuing to the next name. The cameras held their positions during the pause. The article in Marchal's hands was visible in the wide frame throughout, a folded journal, open to an interior spread, the text dense and continuous across both pages. Marchal had not yet read from it aloud. He had set it on the table briefly when his name was announced, a flat placement with both hands, and then lifted it again within seconds and returned it to his reading position. Now it sat open in his hands, with its text facing him and its spine and back cover facing the room. Every person at the table could see the object. Every person in the studio could see that Marchal was holding it and that Bardot was not holding anything. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. By 1966, Brigitte Bardot had spent more than a decade as the most publicly contested figure in French popular culture, not because of what she said in public forums, but because of what others said about her in them. She had been the subject of academic essays, government chamber debates, and church circulars in the same years her films were drawing the largest audiences in French cinema. In almost every case, she had not been present during those discussions. She had been their subject, not their participant, and the distinction had become so fixed that her placement at a serious cultural roundtable was itself a provocation for certain figures whose authority depended on that distinction remaining intact. Édouard Marchal had built his critical standing across 8 years of regular appearances on ORTF cultural programming, the state broadcaster's primetime panels and literary discussions that carried the institutional authority of national cultural discourse. His assessments circulated in editorial offices as reference points. Broadcast producers structured segment guest lists around his availability and framed discussion topics around his published positions. His written work appeared in journals that did not accept unsolicited submissions, and his name on a masthead signaled a level of critical credibility that fewer than 20 writers in France could match in the same period. The article in his hands had been published 3 weeks earlier in a major literary journal with a circulation that extended well beyond literary circles into broadcast media, press offices, and academic departments. It described Bardot's public presence as a cultural symptom rather than a cultural contribution. It questioned her capacity for sustained analytical discourse. Its concluding paragraph framed her continued prominence in French public life as evidence of a declining threshold of critical seriousness across French media. The piece had been reprinted once in a Sunday supplement and cited twice in the press within a week of its original publication. This broadcast was the first occasion on which both figures had been placed at the same table in a live public forum. The roundtable's stated subject, the role of public figures in French cultural life, was framed broadly enough to accommodate almost any line of discussion. Marchal had arrived at the studio carrying the article. Bardot had arrived without one. The production assistant who had assembled the table had placed Marchal's name card 3 seats to Bardot's right, and no one had adjusted the placement. The cameras were rolling, the audience was seated, the broadcast light was red, and the article was in Marchal's hands. The moderator had his notes open in front of him. The table was set as it had been set when the guests took their seats, and nothing on its surface had changed since the broadcast began, except that Marchal had twice lifted and replaced the article, and it was now open and facing him, and the table in front of Bardot was bare. Marchal opened his first substantive contribution to the panel by citing the article by its full title, by his own name as its author, and by the name and issue date of the journal in which it had appeared. He described it as directly relevant to the stated subject of the panel's discussion. His voice did not shift in register when he moved from the citation into the content, no rise in pitch, no shift in pace, no signal that what followed was different in kind from what had preceded it. He read the first paragraph aloud, with the article held open at table height, his eyes down on the page, his head not lifting between sentences. He read the second paragraph at the same pace and in the same posture. He read a portion of the third paragraph, a single sustained sentence that ended with the phrase, "declining critical standards," and then he lowered the article to the table, placed it face up between himself and the center of the panel with a single flat motion, and removed his hands from it. The article lay open on the table, its text visible to anyone seated close enough to read the print, its spine holding the pages flat, Marchal's name visible in the author line above the column of text. Several members of the studio audience shifted in their seats during the reading. Small movements, a straightening of posture, a crossing and uncrossing of arms, the adjustments of people registering something without yet responding to it. The other panelists looked toward the article as it was placed on the table and then looked toward Bardot. The moderator held his notes open in front of him, but had not looked at them since Marchal began reading. The article lay face up on the table between them, its text under the studio lights, the author's name in the line above the column of print. Marchal continued speaking without the article in his hands, his notes still closed in front of him, his remarks building an analytical frame around the passages he had read aloud. He referenced the article once more with a brief gesture toward the table, a controlled motion of his right hand, palm down toward the document, without picking it up again. His remarks addressed the panel as a whole, not Bardot specifically, but each reference to the article's subject matter directed the logical line of his argument toward the same point on the table where the document lay open. The broadcast cameras were no longer all holding the same frame. One lens had moved from the wide shot covering the full panel to a tighter angle that included the table surface, the article lying open on it, and the empty space on the table in front of Bardot's seat. The studio audience had gone still in the way a crowd goes still when it has stopped tracking a program and started watching something that does not yet have an outcome. The programs in several laps had stopped being handled, all eyes turned toward Bardot, as Marchal concluded his remarks and the moderator shifted his gaze in her direction. She had not moved during the reading, her posture the same as when the segment opened, her hands on the table in front of her, her position in her chair, unchanged. The article lay face up on the table between them, its text still visible, its spine still holding the pages flat. The broadcast camera on the tight frame held the article and the empty table surface in front of Bardot in the same shot. The moderator addressed Bardot by name and offered her the floor with a question whether she found the published assessment a useful frame for the discussion the panel had gathered to have. The phrasing was neutral, but the structure of the invitation was not. It named her, it named the assessment, and it asked her to respond to a document she had not been given before the broadcast, that was not on the table in front of her, and that bore another panelist's name at its top. The article was still face up between them. The cameras were on her. The studio audience did not shift or produce sound. The three other panelists at the table looked at Bardot, and then at the article, and then back at Bardot, a sequence of redirected attention that two of the broadcast cameras caught in the wide frame. The moderator held his pen above his open notes, the tip of it not touching the page. Marchal's hands rested on the table to the right of the article, close to its edge, open and still. The point of attention in the studio had narrowed to two locations, Bardot's position at the table and the article lying face up between her and Marchal. The panelist nearest the center of the table had set his pen down beside his notes without writing anything. The panelist on Bardot's right had turned his chair a fraction toward the center of the table, the cameras held, the article did not move. The moderator repeated the invitation. He used her name a second time and restated the question with slightly different phrasing, his voice carrying the neutral cadence of a man filling silence with procedure. The article lay face up on the table. Marchal's hands were still beside it. The broadcast light above the primary camera was red. The studio audience had produced no sound since the moderator first addressed Bardot. The room went quiet as Bardot moved. She brought her right hand from the table surface, where it had been resting, extended her arm across the table in a single direct line toward the article, and made contact with it where it lay face up near the center of the table. Her fingers pressed flat against the open pages, and she drew it toward her, a continuous motion, not two separate actions, the reaching and the drawing in completing themselves in one unbroken movement. As the article reached the edge of her personal space at the table, she brought her other hand up to meet it, and with both hands together, she folded it closed along its original spine crease, a single fold that pressed both hands briefly together before they separated. She set the closed article face down on the table directly in front of her own seat, positioned it with a brief two-handed adjustment so that it sat flat and parallel to the table edge, and placed her left hand flat on top of its back cover. The article was closed. It was face down. It was on her side of the table. The text, the title, and Marchal's name were all facing the table surface. The object that had been the fixed visual point of the exchange since Marchal first lifted it, the document that had been read aloud from, cited by title, placed face up between them, and gestured toward as a reference, was no longer visible. It lay under Bardot's hand, closed face down on the side of the table where it had not originated. Marchal's hands remained open on the table surface in the position they had occupied beside the article. The space between his hands and the center of the table was bare. No one moved at the panel table. The shift from an article lying face up at the center of the table to a closed document face down in front of Bardot had taken less time than the moderator's repeated invitation, but the room's response to it arrived slowly, in stages, each person at the table and in the studio processing the visual change at a different rate. Marchal's hands stayed open on the surface to his left where the article had been, his fingers neither closing nor lifting from the table. The moderator looked at his notes, and then at the table, and then at his notes a second time. He had a question written on the page in front of him, but the premise of the question, which had included the article as a document available to the panel, no longer matched what was on the table. He opened his mouth and held it open without producing sound, then closed it. Two of the other panelists looked at the face-down article in front of Bardot and then turned their eyes to Marchal. The studio audience produced a sound that the overhead microphones registered, not a single response, but a collective small exhale, a compressed version of the kind of sound an audience produces when something resolves that it had been waiting to resolve. The broadcast camera on the tight frame shifted slightly to include both the empty space where the article had been and the face-down document in front of Bardot in the same shot. Marchal's open hands were visible at the left edge of the frame. Marchal looked at the space on the table where the article had been placed. He looked at it in the direct, flat way a person looks at something that is no longer where they left it. He did not look immediately at Bardot. He looked at the empty table surface, and then at his own hands open on either side of it, and then he looked at the moderator. His hands did not close or lift from the table. The panelist at the center of the table picked up his pen, held it above the page, and set it back down without pressing it to the paper. The panelist on Bardot's right straightened fully in his chair and then settled again into a position that was not quite his original posture. The moderator's pen was still above his notes. The article was still face down in front of Bardot, her left hand resting flat on its back cover. Marchal looked once toward the broadcast camera positioned directly across from his seat, a brief, direct look, not an extended one, and then brought his gaze back to the table surface. His notes were closed in front of him. The article was no longer on his side of the table. His hands had not moved from their position. The studio audience had stopped producing the ambient sound that fills a seated crowd in a broadcast studio. The small movements, the whispered exchanges, the programs being folded and unfolded. None of those sounds were present. The overhead lighting above the set produced a low electrical hum that was not normally audible above the crowd noise and was audible now. The cameras held their frames. The panelists at the table sat without writing or speaking. Three of them had their eyes on the table surface, on the empty space, on Marchal's hands, and on the face-down article in front of Bardot. The fourth was watching the moderator. The broadcast light above the primary camera was red. The floor director stood at the edge of the set without moving. No one moved at the table or on the studio floor. The overhead electrical hum continued. Bardot's hand remained flat on the face-down article. Marchal's hands remained open beside the space where it had been. 5 seconds passed. Marchal moved his hands from the table surface to his closed notes, placed both palms flat on top of them, and looked at the moderator. He did not open the notes. He did not speak. The face-down article in front of Bardot did not move. The moderator looked at the table and then at Marchal and then at his own notes, his pen still raised and still not writing. 10 seconds passed. The panelist nearest the center of the table cleared his throat quietly, a single brief sound, and shifted in his chair. Marchal looked toward the sound and then back at the moderator. The moderator looked at the broadcast camera, then down at his notes, then at the panelist on the far left of the table. Bardot's left hand was still on the face-down article. The article had not been touched by anyone other than Bardot since she placed it face down in front of her. 15 seconds passed. The moderator addressed the panelist on the far left of the table by name and introduced a new question about French cultural policy and the relationship between institutional funding and critical independence. The question did not reference the article, did not reference Marchal's remarks, and did not reference Bardot. The panel resumed. The other panelists turned toward the moderator. The face-down article remained in front of Bardot, her hand still on it, visible in the wide broadcast frame for the remainder of the segment. Marchal addressed subsequent questions to the moderator or to the panel as a whole. He consulted his closed notes twice, but did not open them. He did not look toward Bardot's side of the table while speaking, and he did not ask for the article to be returned or reference it again by title or citation. The moderator did not reintroduce it as a discussion document. The segment continued for several more minutes on its new subject. When the broadcast light went dark and the floor director stepped onto the set, the article was still face down in front of Bardot's seat. The moderator closed his notes and set his pen on top of them. The other panelists gathered their materials and pushed back their chairs. Marchal stacked his closed notes and held them in one hand at table height. The article remained where it was, face down, its back cover visible, Bardot's name card beside it, Marchal's name card 3 seats to its right. The article had arrived at the table in Marchal's hands as the primary document of his contribution to the panel, cited, read aloud, placed face up for the room. It had left the table face down on the other side of it, on a surface that was not adjacent to the seat where it had been placed, under a hand that was not the hand that brought it. The segment had continued for several minutes after it moved and had not returned to it. When the studio emptied and the set lights reduced to their off-air level, the article was still there, face down, closed, its text and byline facing the table in a position no one in the room had arranged except Bardot.